Retribution. A son's promise, a tyrant's fall. In the heart of a quiet village, the righteous Lei Feng has earned the admiration of everyone for his integrity, compassion and leadership, qualities that his family lineage is known for. However, dark forces are at play in the form of Cuong, a ruthless drug lord who controls much of the province. Feng's determination to protect his village places him in Cuong's crosshairs, leading to a night of unimaginable horror as Cuong's men exact revenge on Feng's family in a massacre that leaves no survivors but his young children, Lin and Dong. Forced to flee for survival, Lin and Dong are separated, with Lin falling into the hands of heartless captors, and Dong finding shelter with a compassionate stranger. As they grow, Dong harnesses the power of ancient martial arts and spiritual knowledge to seek revenge on those responsible for his family's suffering. He becomes a skilled, relentless force, systematically dismantling Cuong's empire. As he strikes, Lin's spirit returns, guiding him, embodying the family's vow for justice. The endgame pits Dong against Cuong and his entire network, with each shadowy figure succumbing to the brutal retribution that once echoed in Dong's grief and despair. This chilling tale of supernatural revenge unfolds with eerie precision as the spirits of the wronged villagers return to see justice served. Part 1. A revered village head. In the heart of a quiet, mist-laden village nestled among rolling green hills, Lei Feng stood as a beacon of hope, strength, and virtue. He was no ordinary headman. Feng was a man whose life seemed intertwined with the very fabric of his village, his roots as deeply woven into its soil as the ancient oaks that lined its paths. Revered by all, from the youngest child to the village elders, Lei Feng embodied a rare blend of kindness and strength, his every action underscored by fairness and selflessness. In his late 40s, Lei Feng was a solid, steadfast presence, his eyes deep pools of wisdom that seemed to absorb the suffering and joys of those around him. For decades, the villagers had witnessed Feng's generosity, his resolve to uplift their lives in any way he could. Under his leadership, no one went to bed hungry, disputes were settled justly, and he was the first to defend anyone threatened by outside forces. Feng's very name brought an air of comfort and safety, a silent reminder that good men still existed in a world increasingly darkened by greed and corruption. Lei Feng's family had long been revered, and for good reason. Generations of Feng's ancestors had also been heads of this village, each known for their integrity and unshakable dedication to their people. The villagers whispered legends of his forefathers, men who had, in their own time, also faced hardships and fended off threats from rival clans, famine, and disease. Feng's family was the village's heartbeat, its protector, a lineage of resilience and kindness, passed down as surely as the blood in Feng's veins. As headman, Feng maintained the customs and traditions that had bound the community for centuries, traditions that his ancestors had crafted to bring harmony and justice. He organized festivals that brought the villagers together in times of both celebration and mourning. He presided over rituals meant to protect their homes from ill fortune, invoking blessings from ancient deities, and when villagers gathered at night around fires, Feng's words would draw them close, comforting in their steady conviction, captivating in their wisdom. Every story, every ritual he spoke of, held deeper meaning, reminding each listener of their shared identity, their shared strength. To the villagers, Feng was more than a leader. He was a father, a mentor, and a friend. It was said that he remembered every child's name, every elderly villager's needs. With the deftness of a skilled farmer tending his fields, he seemed to know the best way to tend to each soul. When he walked through the village's muddy paths, stopping to talk to the people, his presence was met with warm smiles, respectful bows, and open hearts. A simple greeting from Feng could lift someone's spirits for days, his kind smile lighting up the darkest of moods. Feng's compassion extended beyond his immediate circle. He was known to take in wandering travelers, to provide shelter to refugees fleeing the brutality of the neighboring warlord Cuong, a ruthless drug lord infamous for his merciless control of the region's northern territories. This reputation for compassion and justice marked Feng as a true protector, his influence a warm light that radiated from the village, casting an unseen shield over its people. Yet Cuong's expanding power grew ever closer, a shadow creeping along the edges of the village, waiting. But despite the looming threat of Cuong's wrath, Lei Feng remained unafraid, unwavering. He knew that allowing fear to infiltrate his heart would only bring despair to his people. His steady courage was an inspiration, the villagers clinging to it like a lifeline, especially in the wake of increasingly frightening rumors that reached them from the north. They heard of Cuong's cruelty, stories of people vanishing, villages burned and lives destroyed. They knew that Cuong was infamous for pillaging communities, taking what he wanted without remorse, controlling trade routes, and crushing anyone who dared oppose him. Yet they trusted that their noble headman would keep them safe, as he always had. Feng's daily presence brought them a strange sense of peace, even when rumors of violence and war grew louder. He would reassure them that as long as they held together and honored their traditions, no harm would come to them. To him, the village was not just a place to lead, it was his purpose, his life. And it was a purpose he had prepared his children, Lin and Dong, to carry on when his time eventually ended. Lin, the elder daughter, possessed her father's kindness and resilience, while Dong, a young boy with a spirited energy, mirrored Feng's own dedication to the village. Feng had raised them with values he held dear: integrity, compassion, and justice. The villagers often commented on how proud they were to see the Feng legacy carried on in the next generation, as each child seemed destined to walk the same noble path as their father. In these tranquil days, Lai Feng would often visit the graves of his ancestors at the village's edge, paying homage to the generations that had come before. He would speak to them softly, as if in conversation, asking for their guidance, their blessings, their strength. He knew that, like them, he had become a part of the village's soul. His name, like theirs, would one day be remembered in the stories villagers passed down through the ages. Yet, amidst this quiet reverence, an uneasy silence was settling over the village, a silence that seemed to carry the weight of foreboding, as if the very air itself was thickening with an unseen presence. The villagers felt it too, a nameless dread that gnawed at their hearts, whispering of dark times to come. Every evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, the shadows cast by the forest seemed to grow longer, stretching into the village as though seeking something. And every evening Lai Feng would stand watch from his window, his gaze hardening as he sensed the threat encroaching upon his beloved home. It was a silence that even Feng, in his wisdom, could not ignore. He had heard whispers of Cuong's latest conquests, of his unchecked cruelty, and of how close he had drawn to the village. Rumor had it that Cuong's spies were already in the area, observing, assessing, waiting. Feng knew that his open defiance of Cuong's tyranny had likely put him in the warlord's sights. But he also knew that he could not bend, not if it meant betraying the very people he had sworn to protect. As his children played innocently nearby, unaware of the storm approaching, Feng felt a cold resolve settle in his heart. He would do whatever it took to protect his family and his village, even if it cost him his life. For Lai Feng, there was no greater honor than standing between his people and the darkness that sought to consume them. And he vowed that, come what may, he would be the last line of defense against the terror Cuong's shadow promised to bring. In this quiet but powerful moment, Feng knew he was about to face a battle far more personal and brutal than he had ever encountered. He had no idea that soon, his legacy and everything he had ever loved would hang in the balance. The ancestors he had so often prayed to would be called upon again, but this time it would not be a request for protection, it would be a cry for vengeance that would echo across the generations. Part 2. The Rising Threat. Darkness seeped slowly into every corner of the province, and his name was Cuong. Cuong was no ordinary man, no mere criminal. He was a force that crept like poison into every unsuspecting village, transforming them from peaceful communities into cold, fearful husks. His empire was built on a foundation of blood, betrayal, and an insatiable lust for control. The people whispered his name only in the darkest of nights, when even the moonlight seemed too dangerous a witness to their fear. To speak of him was to invite his gaze, and to invite his gaze was a death sentence. Cuong's rise to power was nothing short of brutal. His henchmen roamed the province like wolves, hunting down those who dared to stand in his way, leaving a trail of charred homes and broken families in their wake. Where he passed, laughter turned to silence, pride to terror. His methods were as varied as they were horrifying: public executions, secret abductions, families wiped from existence. The The province had once been full of prosperous villages, vibrant and close-knit, but one by one they were snuffed out like candles under a cold wind. For Cuong, control wasn't enough. He sought total obedience. He forced each village he conquered to kneel, ripping away their autonomy piece by piece until their people became shadows of themselves, fearful and desperate. Farmers who had once toiled proudly in their fields now worked for him, feeding his forces. Mothers taught their children not to look strangers in the eye, lest they be noticed by Cuong's spies. Even the bravest warriors turned a blind eye to injustice, knowing that any act of rebellion would only bring down his wrath upon their families. But there was one village that remained untouched, standing like a lone tree against the stormly Cuong's village. This village, a small yet defiant speck on the map, was the last true bastion of freedom in the province. Word of its headman, Lei Cuong, reached Cuong's ears soon after he seized control of the neighboring territories. Cuong learned of Cuong's reputation as a fair and honorable man, a man who protected his people with unwavering courage. It was said that Lai Cuong had defied Cuong's forces more than once, refusing to allow his village to fall under the drug lord's rule. Cuong's spies reported that Cuong continued to lead his people with kindness and justice, unfazed by the growing darkness encroaching around them. To Cuong, this defiance was a blatant insult. No one opposed him and lived to tell the tale, and yet Cuong had the audacity to protect his village, to carry on as though Cuong's influence meant nothing to him. It was an affront that Cuong could not ignore. To leave Cuong and his village standing would be to admit that someone could challenge his power, a weakness he would not permit. He watched from the shadows, plotting, waiting for the perfect moment to make his move. Through whispers in the night and messages relayed by spies, he gathered details about Cuong's village, his family, and his people. He learned of the villagers' respect for their headman, of the pride they took in their independence. And most important of all, he learned of the fierce loyalty they held for Cuong, a loyalty that was rooted in love, not fear. Such loyalty disgusted Cuong. To him, loyalty was bought or taken, manipulated by power and wealth. That a mere headman could command such respect through kindness and principle was a mystery he neither understood nor tolerated. His hatred for Cuong grew, festering like a sickness, until it consumed him. This man, this humble headman, had become a symbol of defiance in his domain, a reminder to all that even Cuong's iron grip could be resisted. It had to end. In the dark depths of Cuong's fortress, where no light could reach, he gathered his most trusted henchmen, men who had been with him through his bloodiest days, men who understood the weight of his wrath and the cost of disobedience. He spoke to them of Lai Cuong, of the village that dared to defy him. His voice, like gravel scraping against steel, was laced with venom as he outlined his plan. "This man is a stain on my rule," Cuong hissed, his eyes narrowing with fury. "He thinks himself a hero, a protector. But we will show him what becomes of heroes." A cruel grin spread across his face as he gave his orders. His henchmen nodded in understanding, their expressions a mixture of fear and excitement. They knew that when Cuong set his sights on someone, it was only a matter of time before that person was erased from existence. They had seen it countless times, watched entire villages crumble under his gaze. They were well versed in the art of destruction, and they relished the task that lay ahead. The plan was simple yet devastating. Cuong would strip Cuong of everything he held dear, starting with the people he so fiercely protected. He would send his men into the village, slowly and quietly, watching as they undermined Cuong's authority from within. They would spread rumors, sow discord, turn villager against villager. They would make Cuong's people doubt him, question his ability to protect them. And when the village was weakened, when the seeds of fear and mistrust had taken root, Cuong would strike, ripping Cuong's world apart piece by piece. In the meantime, Cuong's spies reported back, detailing Cuong's every move. They noted how he still welcomed strangers, still shared his food with the hungry, still protected the defenseless. The headman's compassion was his greatest weakness, Cuong thought, a foolish softness that would soon lead to his undoing. Cuong instructed his men to observe and wait, to find the chinks in Cuong's armor, the vulnerable spots, where he could strike and make Cuong fall. As the days passed, the people of the village began to sense an uneasy shift in the air. Strange figures appeared at the edges of the village, watching from the shadows, their faces obscured. Whispers of unease spread among the villagers, a silent acknowledgement that something was coming, something dark and unstoppable. The familiar paths that once felt safe and warm now seemed filled with lurking dangers, shadows shifting in ways they never had before. But Cuong's presence was a balm to their fears. He moved through the village with his usual calm demeanor, reassuring his people with a word here, a touch there. He sensed the growing threat as well, felt it pressing in around him like the tightening grip of a noose. But he refused to let it consume him, to let it seep into the hearts of his people. He reminded them to be strong, to stay united, for he believed that as long as they stood together, no harm could touch them. Yet, even as he spoke these words, a cold realization gnawed at him. He knew that his defiance of Cuong had painted a target on his back, that his refusal to submit had angered a man with the power to crush him. Every day he felt the weight of his responsibilities growing heavier, felt the invisible eyes watching his every move. He knew that Cuong was waiting, that his patience was as endless as it was dangerous. One night, as Cuong stood at the edge of the village, watching the distant lights of Cuong's expanding territories flicker like ghostly flames on the horizon, he felt a chill run through him. There was a premonition, a dark whisper from the depths of his soul warning him that a storm was coming, a storm that would sweep through his village, tearing apart everything he had fought so hard to protect. In his heart, Cuong knew that this storm would bring death and despair, but he also knew that he could not bend, could not surrender. To do so would be to betray everything he stood for, everything his family had fought for over generations. He would stand firm, a lone figure against the rising tide of darkness, ready to face whatever horrors Cuong unleashed upon him. Yet even he could not have foreseen the horrors that awaited, the merciless brutality that Cuong had planned. Cuong was a man who thrived on fear, who fed off the suffering of others. To him, this was not merely a battle for control, it was a game, a twisted, deadly game in which he would stop at nothing, to make Cuong and his village an example for all who dared to defy him. And so, with his fate all but sealed, Lai Cuong returned to his people, his mind stilled with the knowledge that his life, his legacy, and the lives of everyone he loved were at stake. He would fight, even if it meant standing alone against an unstoppable force. But deep down, in the darkest recesses of his soul, a sliver of fear took root, a fear that even he, the village's beacon of hope, might not be enough to withstand the rising threat that loomed ever closer. This fear, unspoken and buried, would be the last gift Cuong would give him, for in the coming days that fear would blossom into a terror so profound, so unrelenting, that it would haunt Cuong and his people to the end of their days. Part 3. A Night of Horror. The night was unnaturally silent, as if the world itself were holding its breath. A heavy fog blanketed the village, rolling in like a sinister tide that swallowed every sound, every shadow. Under the cover of this thick, suffocating mist, Cuong's men advanced silently, their faces masked in darkness, their hearts as cold as the steel they carried. Lai Cuong sat by the warm hearth with his family, oblivious to the horrors that were creeping closer. His wife too was preparing tea, her delicate hands moving with the ease of 1,000 quiet, peaceful nights. Their children, Lin and Dong, sat nearby, their young faces glowing in the firelight, their laughter filling the room. It was a rare moment of peace, a reprieve from the mounting tension that had been brewing for weeks. But even as Cuong smiled at his children, a chill gnawed at his heart. He had felt a growing unease, a feeling he could not shake, a dark premonition that had shadowed him ever since Cuong's spies were first spotted near the village. He had tried to reassure his people, had told them to stay strong, but now, in this quiet moment, with his family, the dread returned, stronger than ever. And then, in an instant, the night shattered. A loud crash echoed through the house as the door was thrown open, the cold wind tearing through the warmth like a knife. Cuong sprang to his feet, his heart pounding as a flood of dark figures poured into the room, their faces obscured by hoods, their eyes gleaming with cruel intent. He recognized them instantly, Cuong's men, his brutal enforcers who brought death and destruction wherever they went. Without a word, they surged forward, blades flashing in the firelight. Cuong lunged to shield his family, his only weapon the fierce love he held for them, a love that ignited his every fiber. He fought with a ferocity born of desperation, his hands grabbing anything he could use as a weapon, a chair, a hot poker from the hearth. But he was outnumbered, his strength no match for the relentless onslaught. The room erupted in chaos. Feng's wife screamed as a blade cut through the air, silencing her cry in a burst of crimson. She fell to the ground, her eyes wide with terror and pain. Lin and Dong watched, frozen in horror, as the life drained from their mother's face. The children's cries were swallowed by the overwhelming din, their small voices lost in the savage violence. Peng, seeing his wife's lifeless body crumpled on the floor, felt a surge of rage so intense it blinded him. He fought harder, ignoring the wounds slashed across his arms, his legs, his chest. But he was only one man, and they were a legion of shadows trained to kill without remorse. Slowly, they overpowered him, pinning him to the ground, his vision blurring as blood trickled into his eyes. He could see his children in the corner, cowering, their faces streaked with tears. He wanted to tell them to run, to escape, but his voice was nothing more than a strangled whisper, lost in the sea of agony consuming him. One of Cuong's men approached him, a cruel smile twisting his face, and raised his blade for the final blow. Your village ... your family ... all will belong to Cuong, the man sneered, his voice dripping with venom. With the last of his strength, Feng locked eyes with his children, his gaze filled with a silent plea, a desperate, unspoken command: survive. And as the blade descended, as the final light of his life was snuffed out, Lin and Dong understood. In that terrible, shattering moment, they understood that their lives were about to be changed forever. Lin, trembling, reached for Dong's hand, her fingers gripping his so tightly it hurt. She could feel his heartbeat, rapid and erratic, mirroring her own terror. Without a second thought, she pulled him to his feet, her instinct to protect him overriding her own fear. Together, they darted toward the back of the house, slipping through a narrow window just as the men turned their attention toward them. The cold night air hit them like a slap, sharp and unforgiving. They ran through the fog, their small feet stumbling over roots and stones, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Behind them, they could hear the shouts of Cuong's men, the sound of boots thudding against the earth as they gave chase. The village, their home, had become a labyrinth of nightmares. Every corner held a new horror, a neighbor's house set ablaze, the screams of friends and loved ones echoing into the darkness. Shadows moved in every direction, and everywhere they looked, there was death, destruction, despair. Lin's mind raced as she struggled to find a way to escape, a path that would lead them to safety. But the village was no longer the safe haven she had known all her life. It was a hellish landscape, a twisted reflection of the terror that had taken root in her heart. She could feel Dong's small hand slipping from her grasp, and she clung to him tighter, determined not to lose him too. They reached the edge of the village, where the trees stood tall and foreboding, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to trap them. Without hesitation, Lin pulled Dong into the forest, hoping the dense foliage would hide them, would keep them safe from the monsters that lurked just behind. They crouched in the underbrush, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. The sounds of pursuit faded into the distance, but the terror remained, pulsing in their veins like a poison. Lin held her brother close, feeling his tiny body shake against hers, his quiet sobs breaking the fragile silence of the forest. For the first time that night, Lin allowed herself to cry. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the dirt and blood smeared on her skin. She clutched Dong tighter, whispering words of comfort she barely believed herself, trying to hold on to some fragment of hope, some sliver of the life they had lost. In the distance, the village burned, a bright, furious blaze that lit up the sky like a funeral pyre. The flames danced in the night, consuming everything they had ever known, everything they had ever loved. Their home, their family, their very identity, all of it was swallowed by the fire, leaving nothing but ashes and memories. As they watched, a dark realization settled over them. They were alone, truly alone, cast into a world that no longer held the safety and warmth they had once taken for granted. They were orphans, stripped of everything familiar, forced into a life of fear and uncertainty. The world they had known had died along with their family, and in its place was a vast, empty void. But even in their grief, a tiny spark remained, flickering faintly in the depths of their souls. It was the last gift their father had given them, a final, unspoken command to survive. That spark, fueled by love, by memory, by the desperate desire to honor their family's legacy, was all they had left. And so as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale glow over the charred remains of their village, Lin and Dong made a silent vow. They would live not just for themselves, but for the family they had lost, for the father who had given everything to protect them. They would carry his spirit with them, let it guide them, strengthen them. They would endure, even in the face of the horrors that lay ahead, even as the shadows of that terrible night haunted their every step. With one last lingering glance at the ruins of their home, Lin took Dong's hand once more. Together, they turned away from the smoldering village and stepped into the unknown, their hearts heavy with grief, but their spirits unbroken. Part 4. Separated and Captive. The dawn's light was weak as it struggled through the fog, casting ghostly shadows across the forest floor. Lin and Dong had been running through the trees for hours, their small bodies battered and exhausted, their breaths coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The events of the night had left them hollow, their minds numb to the horrors that still chased them. They held each other's hands tightly, each an anchor to the other, the only family they had left. But the forest was vast, a maze of twisting paths and thick underbrush. In the faint morning light, Lin's grip on Dong loosened for only a moment, but it was enough. Their hands slipped apart, and in that instant they lost each other. Lin turned back, eyes wide with panic, but all she saw were the shadows that seemed to multiply around her, swallowing her little brother whole. Dong, she cried, her voice hoarse, desperate, but there was no answer. Only silence, stretching endlessly, punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves that sent shivers down her spine. She stumbled forward, her heart pounding, her mind racing with fear and guilt. She had to find him. She was all he had left, his only protection in this cold, unforgiving world. But then, out of the silence, footsteps emerged, a slow, deliberate crunching of leaves that grew louder, more menacing. Lin froze, her instinct screaming at her to run, but before she could move, rough hands seized her from behind, yanking her off her feet. She screamed, kicking and thrashing, but her captor's grip was like iron. "Quiet, girl," a cold voice whispered in her ear, sending a chill down her spine. She twisted, trying to catch a glimpse of her assailant, but all she saw was a glint of metal, a soldier's insignia, gleaming in the dim light. Lin's heart plummeted. She knew what Cuong's men were capable of. She had heard the stories, the whispers that had haunted her village for months. These were not men who would let her go, not men who would show mercy. They dragged her through the forest, her struggles met only with cruel laughter and harsh shoves. She stumbled, fell, her knees scraping against rocks and roots, but they hauled her to her feet, forcing her forward. She called out for Dong, her voice breaking, but the only answer was silence. Her heart shattered with each step, each moment widening the chasm that separated her from her brother. As they left the forest behind, Lin saw the shadowy silhouette of an encampment in the distance. Dark tents clustered together like the maw of a beast waiting to devour her. The smell of smoke and sweat hung heavy in the air, and as they drew closer, she could make out the harsh voices of soldiers, their laughter echoing like the twisted soundtrack of her worst nightmare. Her captors shoved her into a tent, its dark, stifling interior filled with the stench of stale air and fear. They tied her hands and left her alone, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. She could hear the muffled sounds of the camp outside, boots crunching on gravel, low voices exchanging orders, the occasional bark of cruel laughter. She sat in the darkness, her body trembling, her mind racing with questions that had no answers. What would happen to her? Would she ever see Dong again? The thoughts clawed at her, tearing her apart from the inside. The hours stretched on, each one an eternity of dread. Every noise outside the tent made her flinch. Every shadow sent her heart racing. She didn't know when they would come for her, didn't know what they would do. The uncertainty was a torture of its own, a slow, creeping horror that gnawed at her sanity. Finally, the tent flap rustled, and a figure entered, his silhouette outlined by the dim light from outside. He was tall, his face hidden in shadow, but she could feel the malice radiating from him like a palpable force. He stepped closer, his boots crunching against the ground, his gaze fixed on her with a predatory intensity. "You're the girl from Feng's village, aren't you?" His voice was low, mocking. He crouched down, his face mere inches from hers, his breath hot and rancid. "Your father thought he could defy us, thought he could keep you safe." How foolishly Lin's heart hammered in her chest. But she forced herself to meet his gaze, her jaw clenched. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. She would not let him see how terrified she truly was. But the man only laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the tent like the tolling of a death knell. "You're brave, I'll give you that," he said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "But bravery won't save you here." And then he left, leaving her alone in the darkness once more. The days that followed blurred together in a nightmare of suffering and despair. They treated her like an animal, chaining her to the ground, rationing her food and water, taunting her with threats and jeers. She was a prisoner, her every movement watched, her every attempt to escape met with brutal punishment. They pushed her to the edge, testing her will, trying to break her spirit. But through it all she clung to one thought, one sliver of hope that kept her from falling into despair down. She had to believe that he was safe, that he had escaped, that he would find help. She clung to that hope like a lifeline, letting it fuel her, strengthen her. She could endure anything if it meant that her brother was free. Meanwhile, far away, Dong wandered through the forest, lost and alone, his small face streaked with tears and dirt. He called for Lin, his voice hoarse, but only silence answered him. His heart arced with each step, each moment spent without his sister by his side. He was terrified, his mind reeling from the horror of the night, the brutal images that haunted his every thought. As he stumbled through the trees, a figure appeared before him, an old man with kind eyes, his face weathered but gentle. The man approached slowly, his movements careful, as though afraid to frighten the young boy. When he reached Dong, he knelt down, his eyes filled with sorrow and understanding. "You're lost, child," the man said softly, his voice like a balm to Dong's wounded heart. "Where is your family?" Dong's voice broke as he spoke, the words tumbling out in a rush of pain and fear. They killed them. My sister and I, we ran, but we got separated. I don't know where she is." The man's eyes softened, and he placed a comforting hand on Dong's shoulder. "You're safe now, little one. I will help you." He led Dong back to his humble hut, a small, simple dwelling nestled in a quiet corner of the forest. There he cared for the boy, giving him food, water, and a warm place to sleep. The old man, whose name was Tien, listened patiently as Dong recounted the horrors of the night, the loss of his family, the disappearance of his sister. Each word was a dagger to Tien's heart, but he remained strong, his resolve growing with every tear that Dong shed. Tien had seen the cruelty of men like Cuong before, had witnessed the destruction they wrought. But in Dong he saw something different, a spark, a fire that refused to be extinguished. And as the days passed, Tien made a silent vow he would protect this boy, would guide him, would help him find justice for the family he had lost. Under Tien's care, Dong began to heal, though the scars of that night remained. Tien taught him to be strong, to channel his grief into determination, to let his pain drive him forward rather than hold him back. He taught Dong the ways of the forest, showed him how to survive, how to fight. And in Dong's eyes, Tien saw a growing strength, a resolve that mirrored his own. But even as Dong trained and learned, a shadow lingered in his heart, a shadow of his sister, lost somewhere in the darkness, her fate unknown. He could still hear her voice, feel the warmth of her hand in his, and each night he whispered her name, hoping that somehow she would hear him, that somehow she was still alive. And though he could not know it, miles away, in the dark, cold prison of her captivity, Ling heard her brother's voice in her dreams, a faint whisper that gave her the strength to endure. She clung to that voice, let it anchor her, give her hope. And in the depths of her suffering, she made a vow of her own. No matter how long it took, no matter what she had to endure, she would survive. She would find her way back to Dong, and together they would bring justice to the family they had lost, to the village that had been torn apart. But for now they remained separated, Lin a prisoner, her spirit bruised but unbroken, and Dong the young boy, training under the guidance of an elder who had become his only family. Part 5. Training for Vengeance. The nights in the forest were cold, and the darkness seemed endless, stretching into a future that Dong could barely imagine. In those early days, sleep was a brief and restless thing, haunted by memories of fire, screams and blood. But when he awoke, the gentle presence of Elder Tien was there, watching over him like a silent guardian. For days the old man had given him space to grieve, providing comfort in small, quiet ways. He would lay a hand on Dong's shoulder, offer him food without words, and stoke the fire to warm him during the darkest hours. But Dong knew he couldn't stay in that quiet solitude forever. The memories would not let him rest. He needed to be strong, to be more than the frightened boy who had escaped that night. Elder Tien understood this. He had seen the hollow, haunted look in Dong's eyes, the look of someone who had lost everything. The old man knew that this was not the time to let the boy wallow in his sorrow. He sensed a fierce spirit within Dong, the spirit that had been tested and broken, but that still held the embers of resilience. Tien knew he had to nurture those embers, help Dong forge them into the fire that would one day bring justice to those who had wronged him. So one dawn, just as the sun began to pierce the canopy with golden rays, Tien led Dong to a small clearing deep within the forest. Here the elder took a deep breath and let the silence hang between them before speaking. "This will be your sanctuary and your battleground," Tien said softly. "I will teach you the ways of strength and spirit. But remember, vengeance can consume a soul. You must become the master of your pain, not its servant." Dong nodded, his young face solemn. His grief had hardened into resolve, and he knew there was no going back. "I'm ready," he whispered, and so the training began. The first weeks were grueling. Tien did not hold back, pushing Dong to his limits. He taught him the foundations of martial arts, showing him how to move with precision and silence. Every step was measured, every motion practiced again and again until it became a part of him. Tien was merciless in his training, his voice sharp and unyielding as he corrected Dong's stance, his balance, his strikes. But he was also patient, understanding that mastery would not come overnight. Dong's body was young, resilient, and determined, and soon it began to change. Muscles hardened, his reflexes sharpened, his endurance grew. But it was not only his body that transformed. Tien taught him to control his mind, to harness his thoughts like a blade, cutting through the distractions and doubts that tried to pull him back into the darkness of his memories. At night, when the shadows crept closer, threatening to drown him in sorrow, Tien would sit with him by the fire, speaking in a low, steady voice. He told Dong stories of ancient warriors who had faced unimaginable suffering and emerged stronger, their spirits unbroken. He spoke of the power that lay within every person, a power that could be awakened through discipline and purpose. In those moments, Tien's words were a balm, soothing the wounds that could not be seen. But the elder's lessons went beyond physical strength. He taught Dong the art of spiritual resilience, practices that would fortify not only his body but also his soul. They meditated together, sitting for hours in silence, allowing their minds to settle, their thoughts to clear. Tien taught him breathing techniques that calmed his heart, focused his mind, and allowed him to find strength, even in moments of despair. As the months turned to years, Dong became a warrior, his body and spirit honed by the elder's teachings. His every move was calculated, every step deliberate. He learned the art of stealth, how to move through the forest without leaving a trace, how to become a shadow among shadows. Tien showed him how to wield weapons with precision, turning even the simplest objects into deadly tools. But Tien's teachings were not solely about combat. He instilled in Dong a deep respect for the power he wielded, a reminder that strength and skill were meaningless without purpose. "You must remember," Tien would say, his gaze piercing, "that vengeance is a double-edged sword. It can grant you justice, but it can also take your soul." Dong absorbed every lesson, every word. He knew the darkness that waited in his heart, the consuming fire that urged him forward. But he also felt a clarity that he had never known before, a calmness that allowed him to control that fire, to channel it, to shape it into something far more powerful than blind rage. As the years passed, Dong grew not only in strength but also in wisdom. He watched as Tien moved through the world with a quiet dignity, a serenity that belied the immense power he held. Dong learned that true strength was not loud or violent, it was a force that moved silently, a river that carved mountains without ever raising its voice. Under Tien's guidance, Dong also learned to understand the nature of his enemies. The elder told him of men like Cuong, men who thrived on power and fear, who twisted others' lives for their own gain. He taught Dong to see the vulnerabilities in such men, the weakness that lay hidden beneath their strength. Dong listened, his anger simmering quietly beneath his calm exterior. He knew that he would one day face Cuong and his soldiers, that he would walk into the heart of their darkness, and bring the vengeance they deserved. He carried the memory of his family with him, the image of his mother's face, his father's final look, his sister's terrified screams. They became his compass, guiding him through the trials, pushing him to become stronger, faster, more resilient. Yet, even with his growing power, there were moments when the weight of his loss threatened to overwhelm him. In those dark hours, Tien would remind him of the strength that lay within, the unbreakable will that had carried him this far. "You are not alone," Dong the Elder would say, his voice a steady anchor. "Your family's spirit lives on in you. Their strength, their love, it is part of who you are. Let it guide you, let it be your shield." With each passing year, Dong's skills deepened. He had become a shadow in the forest, a silent hunter who moved with deadly grace. He knew how to read the language of nature, how to track his enemies, how to disappear without a trace. He could blend into the night, his presence as quiet as the wind. And yet, beneath this lethal exterior, there remained a heart that beat with love and loss. He had not forgotten the boy he had once been, the innocence that had been stolen from him, but he had transformed that boy's fear into purpose, his pain into strength. He was no longer running from his past, he was walking toward it, unafraid, determined to face the shadows that had haunted him for so long. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the forest in a blood-red light, Dong stood at the edge of the clearing, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains where Cuong's empire lay hidden. He felt the weight of his journey, the years of training and sacrifice, the wisdom that Tien had imparted. He knew that the time had come. Tien joined him, his face solemn but proud. "You have learned all that I can teach you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The path before you is dark, filled with danger and uncertainty. But I believe in you, Dong. I believe in the strength of your heart." Dong turned to his mentor, his eyes fierce with resolve. "I will not forget what you have taught me, and I will not stop until my family's killers are brought to justice." The old man nodded, a tear glistening in his eye. "Go, then, and remember, vengeance is only the beginning. True justice is the legacy you leave behind." With one final, respectful bow, Dong stepped into the shadows, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. He was no longer a child, no longer a victim. He was a warrior forged in the fires of grief, tempered by years of discipline and wisdom. As he disappeared into the night, the forest held its breath, as though sensing the storm that was about to be unleashed. Dong's journey had only just begun, but he knew that he would not rest until he had honored his family's memory, until the blood of his loved ones was avenged, and the darkness that had haunted him was brought to light. He moved swiftly, his body a blur, his mind focused and sharp. Every step brought him closer to his past, to the horrors that still echoed in his dreams. But he was ready now, ready to face the evil that had torn his life apart. And as he vanished into the distance, Tien watched with a mixture of sadness and pride, knowing that he had not just trained a boy, he had set loose a force of retribution, a force that would one day change the fate of their world. Part 6. Return of the Avenger. The village lay in darkness, bathed in the thin, silvery light of a half-hidden moon. Its once lively paths and bustling squares now sat in eerie silence, as if holding its breath, as if waiting. Shadows stretched long and thin, cast by gnarled trees and broken rooftops that seemed to claw at the night sky. The familiar, warm village of Dong's childhood was gone, replaced by a hushed, haunted version of itself, a reflection of all that had been lost. But the silence was more than emptiness. Dong could feel it, a weight in the air that pressed against his skin, prickling like ice. There were memories here, voices that lingered just beyond the edge of hearing. His mother's gentle laugh, his father's wise voice, his sister's bright, ringing call, all echoes in the darkness, reminders of a time long past. Dong moved through the shadows like a wraith, his every step careful and silent. Years of training had honed him into a deadly force, his movements as precise and fluid as the wind. He was dressed in dark, unassuming clothing, his face partially obscured by a hood that cast his features in shadow. But his eyes shone, fierce and focused, brimming with a quiet, simmering rage. The village was still, its houses and fields abandoned, choked by the neglect and cruelty that had taken root in his absence. Every doorway he passed seemed to tell a story, every empty window a silent witness to the suffering that Cuong had brought to this once peaceful place. Dong felt his chest tighten with each step. the memories of his family blending with the haunting silence of the village, forming a pulse of grief and rage that drove him forward. In his mind he could see their faces, his father's strong, proud gaze, his mother's gentle smile, his sister's innocent laughter, and then the images twisted, corrupted, replaced by blood and fire, by screams that echoed through the years. His hand clenched at his sides, knuckles white as he forced the memories back, turning the pain into a weapon, sharpening it into a blade that he would soon unleash upon those who had taken everything from him. Ahead, looming like a dark fortress against the night sky, was Cuong's estate. It was more than a home, it was a fortress fortified with high walls and guarded by men who patrolled the perimeter with deadly focus. Fires burned in braziers along the walls, casting long shadows that flickered and twisted, as if alive. The place reeked of power and cruelty, an iron hand that gripped the village in terror. But Dong was no longer afraid. He had left fear behind in that forest, buried it beneath the years of training, the countless hours spent mastering his body and mind. Fear was a weakness he could no longer afford. Now there was only purpose, a cold, unbreakable resolve that drove him forward, step by step, toward the heart of the nightmare that had haunted him. As he approached the outer wall, he stilled his breath, slipping into the role he had trained for. He became a shadow, a whisper in the night, blending seamlessly with the darkness. Moving quickly and silently, he scaled the wall, his hands finding easy purchase on the rough stones. In moments he was over the top, dropping down into the shadows beyond. Inside the compound, the air was thick with tension. Guards moved in patterns, their eyes scanning the darkness, but they were complacent, unprepared for what was coming. Dom moved among them unseen, slipping past their gazes like a ghost. He could feel the weight of his family's spirits with him, a presence that clung to him like a second skin. They were watching, waiting, their voices silent but their presence unmistakable. He slipped through the corridors, each step bringing him closer to the core of the estate. His mind was a careful calculation, assessing every angle, every guard, every escape route. But beneath that cold focus was a fire, a simmering rage that pulsed with each beat of his heart. His family's suffering, the pain of his people, the cruelty that Cuong had inflicted upon them, all it fueled him, strengthened him. And then, as he turned the corner, he saw it a dimly lit room, lavishly decorated, its walls lined with tapestries and treasures stolen from the very people Cuong had crushed under his heel. And in the center of it all, lounging on a low couch, was Cuong himself, his face illuminated by the glow of a single lantern. Cuong had changed over the years, his once handsome face hardened, his eyes colder and more calculating. He radiated power, a quiet menace that filled the room like a poisonous fog. He was surrounded by a few of his most trusted men, their laughter low and cruel as they drank and shared stories of their exploits. Dong took a deep breath, steadying himself. He felt the weight of his family's spirits beside him, a silent, supportive presence that gave him strength. They were with him, urging him forward, their memories intertwining with his own, guiding his hand as he stepped into the room. The guards saw him first, their laughter dying abruptly as they caught sight of the dark figure standing in the doorway. One of them moved to draw his weapon, but Dong was faster, his movements fluid and deadly. In a flash, he was upon them, striking with a precision that left no room for error. One guard fell, then another, his attack swift and lethal, each blow a calculated strike that echoed with the weight of his training, his loss, his fury. The room erupted into chaos, shouts filling the air as Cuong's men tried to regroup. But Dong was unstoppable, his body moving with a grace that was almost otherworldly, each strike driven by years of pain, of sacrifice, of relentless focus. He moved like a storm, his every step a testament to the years he had spent preparing for this moment, this confrontation that had been seared into his heart since the night he had lost everything. Cuong watched, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and fear. He rose from his seat, his hand gripping the hilt of a dagger as he took a step back, his eyes darting to the guards who lay motionless on the floor. For the first time he looked vulnerable, stripped of the power that had once protected him, faced with the embodiment of the vengeance he had tried so hard to crush. You hissed, recognition dawning in his eyes. "You're Feng's boy," Dong said nothing, his gaze locked on Cuong with a cold, unrelenting intensity. He took a step forward, each movement deliberate, every muscle in his body coiled with purpose. Cuong sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. I thought I killed all of you. Yet here you are, like a ghost. Dong's voice was calm, chilling in its quiet certainty. I am the ghost you created, Cuong, and tonight you will pay for what you've done. Cuong's bravado wavered, a flicker of fear crossing his face as he realized the depth of Dong's resolve, the unbreakable strength that drove him. He raised his dagger, lunging forward in a desperate attempt to strike, but Dong was ready. He sidestepped the attack with ease, his movement swift and precise. In one fluid motion, he disarmed Cuong, his grip on the dagger firm as he held it to the warlord's throat. Cuong's eyes widened, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as he felt the cold steel against his skin. Please, Cuong choked, his voice trembling. Spare me, I can give you anything you want, wealth, power. Just name it. Dong's face remained impassive, his voice low and unyielding. I want justice, for my family, for my village, for everyone you've destroyed. And with those words he ended it. The room fell silent, the air thick with the weight of finality, of a vengeance fulfilled. Dong stood over Cuong's lifeless form, his heart steady, his mind clear. The ghosts of his past had been laid to rest, their voices fading into a quiet peace that wrapped around him like a shroud. As he turned to leave, the spirits of his family and the villagers lingered around him, their presence a warm, comforting glow that guided him through the darkness. He knew they would always be with him, their memories a part of him, their strength woven into his very soul. The village was quiet as he walked away from the estate, the night wrapping around him like a cloak. He felt a sense of calm that he hadn't known in years, a peace that came from knowing that he had honored their memory, that he had brought justice to those who could no longer speak for themselves. He paused at the edge of the village, looking back one last time. The place that had once been his home was now a silent testament to his family's legacy, a place where their spirits could finally rest. He bowed his head, whispering a final farewell, before disappearing into the night, leaving behind the shadows the pain and the vengeance that had once defined him. For the first time, Dong was free. Part 7. Unleashing Retribution. The moon hung low over Cuong's estate, casting a pale, sickly glow across the compound. Shadows stretched and shifted with the flickering light of torches lining the walls, while an unsettling silence settled over the place like a thick fog. But this silence wasn't merely the absence of noise, it was a presence all its own, a heavy, foreboding weight that pressed down on everything it touched. It was as if the night itself were watching, waiting. And in the heart of this silence, a figure moved. Dong slipped through the shadows, his form barely distinguishable from the darkness around him. Years of training had honed him into a creature of silence, his steps careful and measured, each movement calculated to avoid detection. Tonight he was more than just a man, he was the embodiment of vengeance, a force woven from sorrow, anger, and an unwavering sense of justice. But he was not alone. The spirits of his family and the villagers who had suffered under Cuong's tyranny lingered around him, unseen but palpable. They were a presence that pressed against his skin, their whispers a barely perceptible hum that thrummed through the air. Dong could feel their pain, their yearning for justice, and he carried it with him, letting it fuel the fire that burned within his chest. As he moved deeper into the compound, he saw his first target, a guard standing near a brazier, his back turned as he scanned the perimeter with bored, weary eyes. The man had a slight stoop, his hand resting lazily on the hilt of his sword. He was unaware, oblivious to the shadows that shifted around him, growing darker, more menacing. Dong moved with the silent grace of a predator. In a heartbeat, he was behind the guard, his hand clamping over the man's mouth as he drew his blade across his throat in one swift, fluid motion. The guard's body slumped, his life extinguished before he even had time to realize what was happening. As the guard's body hit the ground, the shadows around Dong seemed to deepen, the spirits of the fallen stirring in silent approval. They were with him, each soul a testament to the suffering Cuong had inflicted, each spirit a reminder of the promise he had made to avenge them. The guard's life had been but the first drop in a river of blood that would flow tonight, a river that would carry retribution to those who had caused so much pain. Moving through the compound, Dong struck down Cuong's men one by one, his presence more a phantom than a man. He was swift and unrelenting, each kill precise, efficient. One guard, then another, their lives snuffed out like candles in the wind. They fell in silence, their bodies left as silent markers of the vengeance that swept through the night. As he took down each man, the air grew colder, thicker, as if the spirits around him were drawing closer, feeding off the justice he was delivering. The once quiet compound now held a strange, sinister energy, a feeling that pricked at the remaining guards, sending chills down their spines. They couldn't see him, couldn't hear him, but they felt his presence, the weight of a retribution that had waited too long, the specter of a boy turned Avenger. One guard, stationed near the entrance of the main building, felt a chill run down his spine, the hairs on his neck standing on end. He glanced around nervously, his grip tightening on his spear. In the distance he thought he saw a shadow move, flickering at the edge of his vision. But before he could even draw breath to call out, Dong was upon him, his movements a blur of dark, fluid motion. The guard's eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening in a silent scream as Dong's blade found its mark. In that moment, as life slipped from the guard's eyes, Dong felt a surge of satisfaction, a grim sense of fulfillment. This man had been part of Cuong's reign of terror, a piece of the machinery that had crushed his village, taken his family. And now, that machinery was falling apart, dismantled piece by piece. The spirits around him seemed to pulse with energy, their presence growing stronger with each life he took. Dong could feel their gratitude, their relief. For them, this night was not just about vengeance, it was about release. A chance to finally let go of the pain and suffering they had carried, to find peace in the justice they had long been denied. As he moved toward the inner sanctum of the compound, Dong felt the weight of his mission pressing down on him. He knew that each step brought him closer to Cuong, to the man who had orchestrated the horrors that had scarred his life. His heart beat faster, his blood pulsing with a mix of anger and anticipation. He could almost hear his father's voice, feel his mother's touch, the laughter of his sister, a ghostly chorus that urged him forward, guiding his every step. In a large open courtyard near the center of the estate, a group of guards gathered, their voices hushed as they spoke in nervous whispers. They could sense that something was wrong, though they couldn't explain it. The air felt charged, the shadows darker and more menacing than usual. They cast uneasy glances at one another, each man silently wondering if he would be the next to fall. And then Dong struck. He moved among them like a storm, his blade a blur of silver in the dim torchlight. The guards barely had time to react. Their shouts of alarm cut short as he dispatched them with ruthless efficiency. The air was thick with the scent of blood, the silence broken only by the soft, thudding sounds of bodies hitting the ground. As the last guard fell, Dong stood in the center of the courtyard, his chest heaving with exertion, his gaze fixed on the door that led to Cuong's private chambers. He could feel the spirits around him, a cold, comforting presence that strengthened his resolve. They were with him, urging him forward, their silent voices a testament to the justice he was about to deliver. He pushed open the door, stepping into the dimly lit hallway that led to Cuong's chambers. The walls were lined with tapestries, relics of wealth and power that stood in stark contrast to the suffering and poverty outside. Each step echoed through the silence, a rhythmic beat that seemed to grow louder, more ominous as he drew closer. At the end of the hall he found Cuong's door. He paused, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade as he steadied his breath. The spirits around him seemed to pulse with anticipation, their presence almost tangible, like a cold wind pressing against his skin. This was the moment he had waited for, the moment he had trained for. Every scar, every loss, every moment of pain had led him here. But he pushed open the door, stepping into Cuong's chambers. The room was lavish, filled with treasures and symbols of Cuong's power. And there, in the center of it all, sat Cuong himself, his face twisted with a mixture of anger and fear as he looked up at Dong. Fong's boy Cuong sneered, though his voice trembled. "I thought you'd been left for dead." Dong said nothing, his gaze steady, unyielding. He could feel the weight of his family's spirits beside him, could almost see their faces in the shadows that flickered across the room. Cuong rose, his hand reaching for the dagger at his side, but he was too slow. Dong moved forward, his blade flashing as he struck, his movement precise and merciless. Cuong's dagger clattered to the floor, his eyes widening in shock as Dong's blade found its mark, cutting through the layers of arrogance and cruelty that had defined him. As Cuong fell, gasping for breath, Dong stood over him, his face calm, almost serene. He had fulfilled his promise, had brought justice to those who could no longer speak for themselves. The spirits around him seemed to sigh, a soft, almost inaudible sound that echoed through the room. He could feel their gratitude, their relief, the peace that came from knowing that the cycle of suffering had finally been broken. For a moment, Dong allowed himself to close his eyes, letting the presence of his family wash over him one last time. He could feel their love, their pride, their quiet acceptance. They had been avenged, their spirits set free to find peace. When he opened his eyes, the room was empty, the shadows lifting as the spirits faded into the night, leaving him alone in the silence. He sheathed his blade, his heart steady, his soul lighter than it had been in years. As he left Cuong's estate, the dawn began to break over the village, casting a warm, golden light across the landscape. The horrors of the night melted away, replaced by a calm that stretched across the land like a promise of healing, of renewal, of a life reclaimed. And for the first time since that fateful night, Dong felt truly at peace. Part 8. Cuong's Desperate Plea. The flickering torchlight cast eerie shadows across Cuong's chambers, making the luxurious tapestries and golden relics seem twisted and grotesque, relics of a corrupted soul's hollow achievements. Cuong stood alone, his heart pounding with terror, his pulse a frantic drumbeat that echoed through the silence. Gone was the air of invincibility that had once shrouded him, gone was the confidence with which he had ruled his empire. Now there was only fear, raw and palpable, seizing him like a vice. From the darkness, a figure emerged, Dong, silent and steady, his gaze like steel. He moved with deadly calm, his steps echoing through the room with a finality that sent a shiver down Cuong's spine. The air around him was thick, charged with an energy that was both haunting and unyielding, as if the spirits of the fallen walking beside him, guiding his every step. Cuong's breath hitched. He stumbled backward, his hands shaking as he clutched at his ornate robe, his eyes wide with terror as he stared at the young man who had once been a mere boy, the son of a man he had destroyed without a second thought. But now that boy had returned as an Avenger, as a force that would not be swayed or reasoned with. Please, Cuong stammered, his voice breaking as he dropped to his knees. His pride, his arrogance, all of it crumbled as he faced the reality of his own demise. Please spare me. I'll give you anything you want, wealth, power, lands. Whatever you desire, it's yours. Dong remained silent, his gaze never wavering, his expression a cold mask of resolve. He could feel the presence of the villagers' spirits around him, their anger, their anguish, their silent demands for justice. Their voices whispered in his ears, urging him forward, reminding him of the pain that this man had inflicted, the lives he had torn apart. Cuong's voice grew more desperate, his words spilling out in a frantic torrent. I was only doing what was necessary to survive. This world is cruel, ruthless. I had to be strong, had to make difficult choices. It was never personal. He reached out, his hand trembling as he tried to find some flicker of mercy in Dong's cold, unwavering stare. But Dong's expression remained unreadable, his face a mask of iron resolve. In his mind, he could see the faces of his family, the villagers, those who had suffered at the hands of this man. He remembered their fear, their pain, the hollow emptiness that had filled his heart the night his life had been shattered. And he knew with an unbreakable certainty that Cuong's pleas were nothing more than the empty words of a man who had never known compassion, never cared for the lives he had destroyed. The spirits around him began to grow stronger, their presence thickening the air, making it hard to breathe. Shadows flickered and twisted, taking on the forms of those who had suffered under Cuong's rule, the villagers, the friends, the loved ones who had been lost. Their faces were etched with pain, their eyes burning with a silent fury that sent a chill through Cuong's very soul. No, Cuong's voice was barely a whisper as he looked around, his eyes wide with horror as the spectral figures closed in on him, his hands clawed at his chest, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. No, this isn't real. It can't be, but the spirits were all too real. They moved closer, their forms taking shape in the shadows, their voices rising in a mournful, haunting chorus that filled the room with an echo of their suffering. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing down upon Cuong like a tangible weight, suffocating him, surrounding him with the agony he had inflicted on others. Dong watched in silence, his gaze unrelenting as the spirits surrounded Cuong, their spectral hands reaching out, their faces twisted in expressions of sorrow and rage. This was justice, not the swift mercy of a blade, but a reckoning that would force Cuong to confront every life he had taken, every soul he had crushed, every ounce of suffering he had unleashed upon the world. Cuong fell to the floor, his body racked with convulsions as he clutched his head, his eyes wild and unfocused. The spirit's voices grew louder, a cacophony of pain and fury that echoed through his mind, breaking down the last remnants of his resolve, stripping away his mind piece by piece. "Please, I'm sorry," he screamed, his voice a desperate wail as he writhed on the ground, his hands clawing at the air, as if he could somehow fend off the spirits that surrounded him. "I didn't mean it. I was only trying to survive," but his pleas fell upon deaf ears. The spirits moved closer, their faces filled with the sorrow and fury of the lives he had destroyed, the futures he had stolen. They were not swayed by his words, not softened by his desperation. They had come for justice, for retribution, for the reckoning that Cuong had so long evaded. Dong watched, his heart heavy but resolute. This was the moment he had dreamed of, the moment he had prepared for the chance to finally bring an end to the suffering, to lay to rest the spirits of his family, his village. He had been their voice, their hand, their avenger. And now, as he watched Cuong crumble beneath the weight of his own sins, he knew that justice had been served. Cuong's screams grew weaker, his voice cracking as the spirits closed in, their forms flickering with the ghostly light that filled the room. His once proud face twisted in agony, his eyes wide with terror, as he was forced to confront the faces of those he had wronged, the lives he had shattered. He could feel their pain, their anguish seeping into his soul, tearing him apart from the inside. "No, no more," he whimpered, his voice a faint, broken whisper. But the spirits were relentless, their voices rising in a haunting chorus that filled the room, a symphony of sorrow and wrath that echoed through the walls, reverberating through the darkness. And then, as the final remnants of his sanity slipped away, Cuong fell silent, his body collapsing in a lifeless heap on the cold, hard floor. The room was still, the air thick with the heavy weight of justice, of a promise fulfilled. The spirits lingered for a moment, their faces softened with relief, their forms growing fainter as they began to fade, their voices a quiet murmur of gratitude and peace. Dong stood in the center of the room, his heart pounding, as he watched the last of the spirits drift away, their presence a soft, comforting warmth that enveloped him. He could feel their gratitude, their relief, the sense of peace that came from knowing that justice had finally been served. The weight of their suffering had been lifted, the chains of their torment shattered. For the first time since that terrible night, Dong felt a calm settle over him, a quiet acceptance that filled the emptiness that had haunted him for so long. He had fulfilled his promise, had honored the memory of his family, his village. The vengeance that had driven him, the rage that had fueled his every step, had finally found its purpose. As the last of the spirits faded into the shadows, Dong took a deep breath, the air cold and sharp as it filled his lungs. He could feel the presence of his family around him, a quiet warmth that lingered in the silence, a reminder of the love and strength that had guided him through the darkness. With one final look at Cuong's lifeless form, Dong turned and left the chamber, stepping out into the cool, quiet night. The stars shimmered above, their light casting a gentle glow across the land, a silent witness to the justice that had been served, the peace that had finally been restored. He walked away from the estate, his steps slow and steady, his heart lightened by the knowledge that his family, his village, could finally rest. He had been their avenger, their harbinger of justice, and now, as he stepped into the dawn, he knew that he could finally lay down his own burdens, could find peace in the memory of those he had loved and lost. The night had been long, filled with shadows and sorrow, but with each step, Dong felt the darkness fade, replaced by a quiet, gentle light that warmed his soul, guiding him forward into the promise of a new beginning. Part 9. A Final Goodbye. As dawn broke, a soft, golden light spread across the village, casting away the shadows of the night. The morning mist clung to the trees, weaving through the paths, but the darkness of Cuong's reign had finally lifted. The oppressive silence that had haunted the village for years was gone, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves and the songs of morning birds. The villagers, cautiously stepping from their homes, took in the scene that lay before them. Cuong's once fortified estate was now eerily quiet, its imposing walls and proud banners in shambles. Inside the estate, guards lay motionless, their lifeless forms a testament to the vengeance that had swept through the night. Fires that had once burned bright in Cuong's honor now flickered weakly, casting feeble shadows against walls that had witnessed his tyranny. The lavish tapestries and trinkets that had symbolized his power lay scattered, tarnished relics of a cruel man's empire. Dong stood at the edge of the compound, gazing back at the scene with a quiet, somber expression. He was no longer the broken boy who had once fled in terror, his heart filled with sorrow and loss. He was now an avenger, a warrior forged by grief and tempered by justice. In the soft light of dawn, he felt the presence of his family, their spirits lingering in the air, wrapping him in a sense of warmth and pride. The weight of his promise had been fulfilled, the vow he had made to his family honored. He had brought justice to the village, to the souls who had been silenced by Cuong's cruelty. His family, his people, they were at peace now, their spirits free to rest. Dong closed his eyes, taking a deep, steadying breath as he felt their gratitude, their love, their quiet acceptance. He knew that this was the moment he had been preparing for all these years, the final chapter of a story that had begun with blood and fire. As he stood there, he recalled the words of Elder Tien, the man who had saved him, trained him, and guided him down this path. True justice is not just about vengeance, Tien had once told him, his voice soft but firm. It's about creating a world where no one else has to suffer the same fate. Dong had carried those words with him, letting them anchor him when the rage threatened to consume him, when the grief became too much to bear. And now, as he looked at the village he had once called home, he felt those words settle within him, a new purpose taking root in his heart. He knew that his work was not done. Though his family had been avenged, there were still others out there, others who suffered under the cruelty of men like Cuong. He could not bring his family back, but he could ensure that others did not have to face the same horrors, that no other child would have to lose everything in a single night of terror. With a final, lingering glance at Cuong's estate, Dong turned away, his step steady and resolute. The villagers watched him in silence, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe, gratitude and sadness. They had known him as a boy, had seen him grow into the man who had brought them justice, who had freed them from the darkness that had plagued their lives. But they understood that he could not stay, that his path lay beyond the village, in the places where justice was needed most. As he walked through the village one last time, he felt the memories of his childhood rising to the surface, the laughter, the warmth, the moments of simple joy he had shared with his family. He could see his father's strong, reassuring gaze, his mother's gentle smile, his sister's bright, innocent laughter. They were with him, their love woven into the fabric of his being, their strength a part of him. He stopped at the edge of the village, turning back to face the people who had gathered to watch him leave. They were silent, their faces lined with the scars of the years they had endured under Cuong's rule, but their eyes were bright with hope, with the newfound strength that had been rekindled by the justice Dong had brought them. One of the elder villagers stepped forward, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Thank you, Dong, for everything. We will never forget what you've done for us." Dong inclined his head, his gaze solemn. "I only did what was right," he replied, his voice steady. "Honor the memories of those we've lost, and never let the darkness take hold here again." The elder nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We will remember," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "Your family, your bravery, it will live on in our hearts." Dong took a deep breath, letting the weight of those words settle over him. He knew that he could not linger, that his path lay elsewhere, but he was grateful for the closure, for the chance to say a final goodbye to the village that had once been his home. With a last nod, he turned and walked away, his steps carrying him toward the rising sun, toward a future that held both uncertainty and purpose. The villagers watched him go, their hearts filled with a mixture of sorrow and pride, knowing that they had witnessed the end of one story and the beginning of another. As he walked into the morning light, Dong felt a sense of peace that he had not known since that fateful night so many years ago. His family spirits had been laid to rest, their suffering avenged, their memories honored. He was no longer bound by the past, no longer driven solely by the need for vengeance. He had found a new purpose, a new path, one that would lead him to those who needed justice, to those who needed hope. He would become a protector, a guardian of those who could not defend themselves. He would honor his family's memory, not just through vengeance, but through compassion, through the quiet strength that Elder Tien had taught him. He would be the shield that others could rely on, the sword that struck down those who preyed upon the innocent, the road stretched out before him, bathed in the warm, golden light of a new day, and as he walked he felt the weight of his journey lift, replaced by a sense of calm, of purpose. He was no longer a boy haunted by the ghosts of his past, no longer a man consumed by the need for revenge, but he was a warrior, a protector, a harbinger of justice. And as he disappeared into the distance, the village he left behind began to heal, its people standing tall as they faced the dawn, their hearts lifted by the courage of a boy who had become a legend that would inspire them for generations to come. Dong was gone, but his spirit remained, a silent promise that they would never again be abandoned, never again left to suffer in the darkness. For he was more than just an avenger, he was a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times justice would prevail. And though his path was long and uncertain, he walked it with the knowledge that his family's love, their strength, would guide him, lighting his way as he brought peace and protection to a world that so desperately needed it.